scrapbook. So Marlene, thank you for pushing me into accepting this. And I got the start on the scrapbook, and I have some pictures here. I got the scrapbook, I have some maps. For those of you that are interested after the talk, it'll be my pleasure to share some of those with you. This talk is going to be about 25 minutes, so if you want to set your alarm clocks, fine. I know Al is going to keep track of me. Right there, okay. Anyway, I've invited my daughter Melinda to videotape this because I find when I speak to my grandchildren or my children, about 2 seconds into it, they grab that phone or they're texting, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, okay? So I welcome the opportunity to have 15, 20 minutes where I can talk interrupted and where people will actually listen. So I promise to make it interesting enough for you. So this talk is about a bike ride that Yoka and I took in 1996. We left from Napa on the bicycle, rode all the way down to Los Angeles, flew from LA to Boston, and then rode back pretty much all the way across the country from Boston. So we did a total of 3,500 miles in about 10 weeks. Let me give you a little bit of biking history first. Yoka and I grew up in the Netherlands in the early 50s, and we were always used to riding our bikes wherever we needed to go because that's all we had. In fact, I remember giving Yoka a ride on the crossbar of my bike when I first met her after a dance. And we've been married 54 years now, so that goes back a long ways. Anyway, when our family of 8, my parents' 6 children, arrived here in Napa in 1957, the first thing out of the packing crate were our bicycles, because that's what we were used to. And in the 1960s and 70s, when we were raising our children, I fixed up our bikes with 2 seats, one in front, one in back, one in front, one in back, to accommodate all 6 of us on the 2 bicycles. And we always used the bikes around town for errands, and in the 70s and 80s, I regularly commuted to Mare Island on the bicycle. I was part of a group that would meet at 6:30 in front of an upstate hospital, and we would ride together 36 miles a day, round trip. I was in pretty good shape at that time. Anyway, several times Yoka and I have made fairly long trips. Once we flew into Canada. I rode there. I rode back from Canada into to Seattle, flew back from there. Another time we flew into Portland. I rode all the way back from there. Another time we left here, rode all the way down the coast to San Diego, and came back through the Central Valley. So in 1995, I challenged Yoka to go for a really long bike ride with me. Those were just short ones. And I said, let's go coast to coast. So we discussed numerous routes and distances, and I talked to several people who had gone cross country, mostly west to east because of the prevailing winds. And at that time I questioned if it was even possible for people our age, I was 58, she was 57, to actually ride that far, because we weren't certain. Anyway, talked to a young fellow from Napa who told me of his group ride across America, and he gave me the 10 maps, the bicycle maps that looked like this instead of 10, and that was worth about $60 at the time, so that gift helped me make up my mind. We were going the northern route, and we were going east to west, even though the prevailing winds would be against us. And slowly, our route got fixed by other factors. Our daughter Maria, who was a young mom at the time, asked us to babysit the kids for a few days in June, while she and her husband would go on a short vacation. They live in Santa Barbara, so I just counted backwards the number of days it would take for us to reach Santa Barbara, and it gave us a starting date of May 25th, 1996. At that time, I had already been retired from Mare Island, but I was working half-time at First Christian Church as the outreach director, and a missionary friend took over my duties and also lived in our home for the time that we were away, and Yoka was able to get time off from her teaching job at Napa Valley College. So in March of '96, we started training in earnest, reading bicycling magazine articles, first riding 20 to 40 miles a day without a load, and then gradually adding weight to our panniers, so that by May 25th, we felt capable of riding up to 40 miles a day with loaded bikes. My bike loaded down with panniers and all my gear, if I picked it up, was over 100 pounds. And then my 180 on top of that, so I was pushing quite a load. So at any rate, we started buying the proper gear and clothing. We bought 2 new special built road bikes from a frame builder in Petaluma, who was famous for his rock and road touring bikes. And later on, during the ride, we were really very glad for strong equipment because it came in good. Anyway, on May 25th, we said goodbye to our kids and grandkids. We rode off to Vallejo, got on the ferry to San Francisco. We rode through town, and we rode down Highway 1, 550 miles all the way to Los Angeles, and we stopped in Santa Barbara to babysit the 5 girls, as I mentioned. So we continued our ride to Los Angeles, stayed at a friend's home in Santa Monica, and disassembled and packed the bikes into boxes. And then from LA, we flew with the bikes to Boston, where I had arranged contact where we could stay overnight, and this guy helped me the following morning put our bikes back together. And that afternoon we explored Boston, and then we started going west, and we continued our expedition. You know, navigation on a long tour is actually pretty easy. I merely buy a new state map at each state line, and as you can see, I marked a route in red, and we would just stick it in an envelope and mail the completed maps of the state back home, where Belinda's kids would mark the progress on a large US map. So the idea was to just keep going west. Well, we found out the hard way that that was easier said than done. Massachusetts is a very wooded state, and it was a cloudy day, and we didn't see the sun. We rode all day, stopping in many old cemeteries, and we found ourselves back near where we started from. That was day 1. Anyway, the following day at the sports shop, I bought a compass. That wasn't going to happen to me again. Passing through New York State, we climbed 4,000 feet across the Catskill Mountains, and we were surprised, even though it was June, when we got on top of the mountain, there was snow there, and really froze our bunnies off. It was cold. And anyway, got through the mountains. We came through a forest where we heard an eerie noise that grew louder and louder, and it was like crackling electrical wires. And we rode right into a storm of what looked like big crickets. There were millions of them. They were all over us, on our hair, our clothing, our bikes, and it was very scary and alarming. You should have heard her. And me too. Anyway, we found out later that these were flying cicadas, about 2 inches long, and they had just awakened and came out of the ground in a 17-year cycle. 2 years ago, 17 years left after our ride, I read about the cicadas coming out, New York State, Pennsylvania, all over there, by the billions. And it's interesting, these cicadas, they live underground for 17 years, they come out, they live for a couple of weeks, lay their eggs, mate, and then they die. But we were just happening to be there when they had just come out of the ground, and they were swarming all over, and the noise was so loud, it was up to 90 decibels. Some of you engineer types know what that means. It's very, very loud and scary. Anyway, after New York, we entered Pennsylvania with those really long roller coaster hills. And we went through Amish country with the black buggies and the horses and people in the old-fashioned clothing. And then passing through Ohio and Indiana, we kind of angled on up towards Chicago. On the way to Chicago, we stopped at a motel in Gary, Indiana. We were totally beat. We chained our bikes to a fence near the motel, and while going back to the bikes to get something, a city cop motioned me over and asked what we were doing here. He shook his head after I told him. He said, take your bikes inside the room. Don't leave them outside. Take your bikes inside the room, lock the door, close the blinds, and don't come out. I said, what the heck is going on? He said, you happen to pick a motel that's for truck drivers and hookers. Very unsafe. Gary, Indiana, at that time had a strong criminal element. In fact, it was called the murder capital of the United States. So it was not a good thing. Anyway, of course, I did not tell Yoka any of that until the following morning, or we would not have slept a wink, and she would have insisted that we move elsewhere. Anyway, stuff like that does happen. So on to Chicago, and there we happened to get there when the Taste of Chicago food fair was going on. So we sampled a lot of delicacies, and then later shared a bike path along the shores of Lake Michigan with thousands of bicyclists, walkers, and rollerbladers. Crossing Wisconsin, we went through Madison, I remember. Crossing Wisconsin and Minnesota became more difficult, increasingly fighting the prevailing westerly winds, always treating sore body parts. I had a sore bum the whole ride. And also noticing that towns and opportunities to buy supplies became further and further apart. We stopped along the Mississippi River on the 4th of July, and we celebrated with a boat ride on the Mississippi, and then watched the fireworks along the river. Somewhere in Ohio, along a country road, about 2,000 miles into our expedition, we encountered two men coming the other way, also bicycle touring. They were coasting with the wind, and we were straining into it. So I rued the day that I made a decision to go east-west. Anyway, we stopped and chatted like two ships meeting in the middle of the ocean. We made it to Fargo, North Dakota, when we decided to take a train ride overnight to Spokane, Washington. Yoka had to be back at a certain date to continue her teaching, and by doing this, it would allow us to continue our ride in Spokane, Washington, and cross down eastern Washington State, come down to the Columbia River, follow that one for a couple of 100 miles, take a left in Portland, and come back down. But we had pictured Washington State rainy, green. Instead, we happened to be on the east side of the Cascades, where it was very hot. We saw nothing but dust devils whirling all around us. We had to do 50 to 80 miles a day in 118-degree heat at times, so it was very difficult. And then along the Columbia River, which is known for its strong winds coming from the sea, going inland, we were going the other way, of course. And we followed that one for a couple of 100 miles. But once we took a left turn at Portland, Oregon, we said goodbye to the Columbia River and got the wind in our back for once. We felt we pretty much had it made. We were back on our side of the continent. We were only had about 800 miles to go, and we were going home. At one point, somewhere in Ohio, one of our grandkids talking to Yoka asked her when she would come home, and I remember hearing Yoka say, I'm pedaling as fast as I can. You might be interested to hear what a typical day on the road would be like. Up at about 5:30, coffee and oatmeal on a Whisper Light camp stove, stuffing the sleeping bags and roll up the thermal rest pads, fill the water bottles, unlock and dry the bikes, check the tires, lubricate the chains, load the bikes and tighten the bungee cords. Before we left, we would always pray together for safety. And we'd start riding. After 15 or 20 miles of riding, we would stop for breakfast or we fix peanut butter sandwiches. Then we'd ride another 15 or 20 miles, stop for lunch. We always had a fantastic appetite and couldn't be big enough. And you wonder why. Anyway, during the lunch I would hang the tent out to dry because when we break camp early in the morning it would always be wet. We'd fill the water bottles. And in restaurants, it became a routine for us to take a back booth so we could close our eyes for half an hour. And at that point, we would review the map, ask the people around us how best to get across their state, and we would evaluate their input for the following day's ride. After lunch, we'd ride some more, another 20 or 30 miles. And about 4 or 5 p.m. we'd start looking for a campground or a motel, set up the tent, unload the gear, start dinner, usually a package of noodles, Cajun rice, ramen, can of pork and beans or chili. After dinner then we would relax or I'd be fixing flats. We'd take a short walk, record our notes, talk to other travelers, review our maps, turn in and do it all over again tomorrow. We ended up riding for 60 out of the 70 days of the trip, and we averaged 58 miles a day. Now on a trip like that, you can expect some highlights and some lowlights. So I'll tell you a couple of each. We had a motto: if God leads you to it, He will lead you through it. Here and there, the Lord showed us that He loves us and takes care of us. And there were times when we were down and He sent us caring people to show us hospitality and lift us up. At other times we were on top of the world and literally singing His praises at the top of our lungs. Do you remember that? To this day I can't hear the song "It Is Well With My Soul" without getting a little emotional. And because I had a very visible sign hanging on my bike, proclaiming, witnessing the good news from coast to coast, we had many opportunities to share a short testimony and also to pray with different people. We believe that God used us on this ride to interact with people of His choosing. And of course we also fielded a lot of questions. How far are you going? Well, we're going coast to coast, east coast to west coast. How many miles a day do you do? Well, 40 to 80 miles a day. In fact, one time we did over 90. That happened to be in Wisconsin on very nice roads. But we averaged 58 miles a day. Then the big question, why? That's a good question. Well, we wanted to challenge ourselves to become physically strong and to complete this expedition, and I don't call it a vacation, it was an expedition relying only on each other. We carried all our gear on our bikes and did not have a sag wagon following us. And this turned out to be the once-in-a-lifetime event in our lives, one that we look back on with smiles as we recount the events, one that we have shared with our family and friends, and it often came up when I shared my stories with groups of bicyclists on my tours. Until 2 months ago, I was a bicycle tour guide, and I've retired from that. So another highlight is the inherent goodness of people. When we are touring, it is obvious to people we meet that there's just the two of us. We make ourselves very vulnerable, and people sense that we pose no threat, and they respond to that. I know our children questioned our sanity, and we're concerned about our safety. In fact, one of my daughters-in-law is a policewoman. She offered me one of her guns to take along for safety, but I refused. We like to rely on the Lord alone. So people invited us into their homes. They let us set up our tent in their backyards. They gave us opportunities to get out of the rain for the night. For example, riding along quiet country roads, say somewhere in the cornfield near Bowling Green, Indiana. A guy slows down, rolls down his window, leans out and says, "Hey, where are you going?" "Going coast to coast." "Where are you staying tonight?" "Don't know yet, follow me." That kind of thing. This particular guy, his name was Rick. He was a foundry worker making engine blocks for Detroit. We had a fun evening. He invited us to his home. We met his family. Someone went out to get pizza. And they invited the neighbors to meet these crazy Californians. And Yoka ended up massaging his wife's sore back. And we ended up sleeping on the living room, on the floor. And we were gone again by 7 the following morning. So that was kind of typical. That happened about 14, 18 times during the trip. Here's another example. Along the Mississippi River near Elk River, Minnesota, it was a hot and muggy day. We had stopped to get an ice cream in the afternoon, and we heard something about bad weather. We got back on our bikes, and it started raining. We were trying to get to a motel. A woman stops the car in front of us. She gets out in heavy rain. There's thunder, there's lightning. And she tells us there's a tornado on our heels. We have to get off the road. So she tells me later that that area gets about 24 to 30 tornadoes a year. So we followed her to her home on the bank of the Mississippi River. We were very cold and shivering, so there's a very pleasant sight. I can recall it to this day of the garage door opening, us riding into this nice, dry, warm place. We had a chance to take a shower, change our clothes. We went upstairs, met the family. Turned out they had 4 kids, we had 4 kids. They liked music, we liked music. We ended up playing music and singing and just had a marvelous time. We were lucky that the tornado veered away and did not hit us. But we did see the following day trees and power lines down after we left there. Interesting, this particular couple I remember because years later we were able to reciprocate. We kept in touch. We reciprocated when they came to California, and we were able to host them for a couple of days. Something else I remember, Claudio, remember the Italian? Mm-hmm. We met a guy, Italian fella in his 40s, I think, riding alone from San Francisco to Los Angeles. We met him along Highway 1. He had his own issues to work through, and sometimes after a phone call, I'd see him wiping his eyes and crying. But he was delighted to have company. We lost contact a couple of times over the next few days, and the second time I remember, we had stopped at a motel and didn't see Claudio at all, but the following morning when we got out on a hunch, I kind of circled the motel. I saw him coming out of the room. So we were able to come up again. So he rolled his eyes, he clapped and said, "Thank you, Lord, thank you, Lord." He so needed the company, and it was so much fun. We kept in touch with him for quite a long ways also. And also on Highway 1, we followed a group of riders with a hot tub being towed behind their sag wagon. So they carried, the sag wagon carried all their gear, and there was a hot tub being towed behind the sag wagon. They would send that hot tub up ahead, set up camp. It'd be hot by the time they got to camp. Well, that's what I call the next higher level of camping. In Yoka, that's what we're going to do if we can do it again. And we followed them into camp, and we did get to enjoy that as well. Then, to oppose, we got the highlights, but there's also lowlights. I had to fix a lot of flats. But thankfully the bikes were configured to get the wheels out quickly, and every night we had saddle sores. We were exhausted sometimes. We had very bad weather, a wind in Southern California, lots of rain. Minnesota, and then for 200 miles along the Columbia River, rain and wind. I remember one night we sitting in our tent, we were both holding up the walls to keep the tent from collapsing in the strong wind and the rain, and I ended up going out at my skivvies, taking 50-gallon drums and piling them, setting them around the tent to provide a windbreak. It was pretty bad. Another low light, sometimes arguments. Hey, even though we'd been married a long time by that time, we still had arguments. For instance, I can move 100 yards off the highway and rough it overnight, but she wants a campground or a motel. So that was part of the problem. And you know there are two theories about arguing with a woman, and neither one works. When mama ain't happy, nobody's happy, so I try and accommodate that. In fact, after we returned, Yoka gave a talk one time to a women's group and labeled it "Deal with It." And it refers to the time when she was ready to give up, ditch her bike, fly home, and I had to grab her shoulders and shake it and say, "Deal with it." So at any rate, here are my reflections after this long bike ride. This United States of America is a big country. Realize that it takes an airplane flying at 500 miles an hour, 7 hours to cross. And we did it mostly on the bicycle. So we feel proud to have done this under our own power, and we are much stronger for it. We have a lot of experiences and anecdotes to share, but we were also glad to be home and do our normal things again. So it has become something our kids and grandkids can share with their friends. So the facts were that we bicycled 3,500 miles in 10 weeks, averaged 58 miles a day. We rode 60 days out of the 70, camped about 25 nights, motels and hostels 27 nights, hospitality by strangers 15 times. This is the kind, as I just described, where the guy would just invite us, just total strangers. Anyway, that kind of sums it up. I've come to the end of my time, I know that. But I have some pictures here. I have the maps here for those of you that